right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. A few things to note before we go here. Today we're going to be talking about server troubleshooting, but a lot of this is going to be around errors that you get during publication. We were going to do some troubleshooting on the actual server today, but my physical machine that's the server sits on went down last night, and we haven't been able to get it up. So we're not going to do that today. We're going to talk a little bit about APIs in its place. And then I also only have one arm. Currently, I had surgery on Friday, so I'm going to be doing things with my left arm. So you'll have to excuse me if things aren't happening as quickly as they usually do. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we're going to go from here. My name is Trayson Marks. I'm an Alteryx ace. I've been doing Alteryx trainings and enablement for the better part of 7 years at a bunch of different organizations and at a bunch of different levels. So I'm very excited to get to talk to you today about some of the things that I see when we work through like server usage, common errors people see, and common things that maybe users as well as the team that's managing the server doesn't necessarily think about training people in or training on how to troubleshoot when they get a new server instance. So I hope that some of the things that we talk about today will help lead you to a better future. A lot of this is more also like we're trying to be more preventative, so you may not see the value of this in your deployment because you've already prevented some things from happening, but a lot of these good best practices are good to hold on to. Today we're going to talk about some common areas of concerns as well as best practices to avoid these issues, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the APIs, and then I was going to talk about Mongo, but I can't now, so you'll have to ignore that, and I apologize. Common areas where issues arise. So the four biggest places I see things happening on our server are during the publication. So when we're actually pushing workflows up, the issues on the workflow itself. So a lot of times that's, maybe a user didn't do their due diligence to clean it up and make sure it runs as well as it can. So you'll see that start to affect your server. And then things with data connections, which I think we talked at length about data connections before, but we're going to go back over that. We're going to talk about the DCM as well as data connections within Alteryx and how to best use those. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the job queue. And we'll talk kind of back to some of the points I made last week about how you can build workflows checking against the Mongo. And unfortunately, I can't show you any of this, but checking against the Mongo to look at like your queue and to get a better, more holistic view of the future of your Alteryx server, as well as the past, to see when things have queued up. Publishing Alteryx workflows. So I'm sure we've all seen this image here on the right where when you're saving a workflow, something fails, or even below where you see two exact copies of the same workflow in somebody's workspace. These are like the most common publishing errors. Generally, we talk about missing dependencies. So if you have a workflow in your tool and the workflow doesn't exist on your server, a macro in your tool and the macro doesn't exist in your server, or you have some data connection, which we'll talk more in length later, that you've created and that doesn't exist within your server. Those are where we're going to see issues saving our workflows here. We can also, unfortunately, create duplication of your workflows. So sometimes you'll see like in this image show, you see these two workflows here. They're essentially the same workflow, but now I've got two different objects, which creates issues for me down the road when we talk about things like lineage. Let me show you on my server where this affects and why we want to make sure that we only ever have one item for lineage here. So within my workspace here, I've got these two workflows, which are demo for duplication. This one right here, I saved it twice. I've got errors on here because I was trying to demo error. But so let's say this was working I've got my different versions of my workflow. So one of the things that, a big sell for the Alteryx server is version controlling. So if people are updating their workflows and they need to jump back a version, or you're going to create multiple versions and someone needs to just run an older version to see what the results look like, all of that is available to you in the Alteryx server. Notice that because I have I was able to get this the lineage to stay on this item. I have 2 published versions. I have comments here, which during the publication process, I'll show you how we make sure we get this set up. But we have our comments on here, so I can say, hey, what changed between these 2 versions here? If you are using anything like Git or like ServiceNow, some sort of ticketing system, in order to make adjustments to your workflows, you can add all the comments here about like what ticket number it is. So if you have documentation on some third-party platform, you can make sure people can refer back to that ticket for any changes here. So it's very important to make sure we're keeping our versions in line. If you want to change the published version, you quickly come in here and you say, oh, I want to make sure version 1 is the one that no one runs. So notice here that my published version is 1. If I were to run it, it would run this version 1 versus version 2. You can also in here, click on this and say, oh, I just want to run version 2 to see what the results look like. We give it a job name. But you can also download it here to see what the difference is between version 1 and version 2. This is very important because what has happened for this example is that I also have, this 3rd version here, which because I didn't publish it correctly, created an entire new lineage here. So I don't, well, other than I know that these names are the same and I trace and mark so that there's the same workflow, there's no way to like tie these 2 versions of the workflow together. So if you are managing your server, this could become problematic because you'll have a lot of different objects within your server, and then it becomes messy. So real quickly, I'll show you how to do this, how to make sure that we are keeping our lineage going here. So if I open a workflow, let's say I need to make an adjustment to a workflow. I go to my gallery and I say, oh, I need to grab, let's go to workflows and let's make sure that I am just getting my private studio. Oh, whoops, it's an app because it's interesting that it's not showing up here. Give me one moment. Workflow. You can also say open recent. So if I want to open this workflow demo for duplication, I can here. And then let's say I want to make an adjustment to this. Let's say I just want to add a browse tool here, and I want to allow this to show my results. Oops, sorry. I'm going to blame that on the left hand. Let's see if I got my interface designer. Anyway, so we say this workflow is like, okay, we made a change here. We added a browse tool, but we would want to, okay, so here's where this becomes an issue. If I click save as, what it's going to do is it's going to create, if I save as private gallery development or whatever server your server name is, it's going to create a new lineage or a new object. What I want to make sure I'm doing here is just clicking save. And it's going to make sure that I bring it into our demo for duplication. And I will say this is the 3 added new tool per ticket number 1. And I say, okay, I save. It's going to do my validating. I say, okay, I say view in browser. It's going to open up my gallery for me real quick. And then we see, okay, and sorry, I'm still on the wrong lineage here, but now we do see where I have created a new version and I have added comments here. So as I'm updating this workflow, I want to make sure that I stick to a single version of that workflow. Yes, back to our that's kind of one of the errors we see here. So again, we want to make sure we're doing that correctly. And then just to note on the macro thing, if you're unfamiliar with macros, on your server, on the actual physical machine, what you need to do is you need to set up a macro repository, which is done through the user settings. And what you'll do is you'll create some location that users can drop their workflows into, or their macros into. Now, there's two ways to manage this. I would either suggest, if you trust your users, creating some sort of shared drive. So like if you have like we have our Z drive, and that's anyone can access our Z drive, right? So I put my macros in my Z drive, and that way when I publish it, the Alteryx machine that my workflows are published to has access to that path, so it knows where to go get the macros. So that's one option. The value of that is that users can add their own macros to this repository, and there's no, like, you don't have to manage it. Someone else doesn't have to manage it. The negative side to that is if they accidentally delete it or they mess it up, and then it affects workflows. So again, it comes down to kind of your trust in your users. The other option is to create like a local space. So on the machine, let's say it's on the machine that the server is installed to. But then depending on, your access to that machine, you could, there might be some more overhead to that. So someone would have to say, hey, please publish this macro, and then you have to go in on the machine and then drop it in there. You could theoretically do the same thing for a shared drive that only you know about and you have the access to. However you want to do that is fine. The other way to kind of get around this is to embed macros. So if I was to, this worked because I embedded macros. So when I say save here, when I say save here, I go to workflow options. I can say manage workflow assets. You see now this externals folder is temp, but like if this was in my Z drive in that folder I was talking about earlier, I can just come in here and click on this to make sure that it takes the macro with it and it's now embedded in the workflow. The problem with that, the issue that could arise with that is that now it's that version of the macro. So if you need to change that version, that macro, you'll have to download the workflow, repoint it to the new version of the macro, and then republish it because it's embedded in there. So that can become unwieldy at some point. Like if you have hundreds of users and they're all embedding macros and you're not quite sure what the versions look like, that can kind of get out of hand. But at some point, either your local users need to be aware of this or managing this on their own. So these are options for you. And that's how you bypass that error around publication. Let's see. So someone's asking a question regarding macro path. If we give a path, let's see, D, so macro, how I place the macro in D, ABC, new folder. So Vijay, in your question, is D, if D is a shared folder, well, okay, sorry. So if D drive is like, so when we suggest people install their Alteryx server, we suggest that, the main installation happens on C drive, and then you'd have a separate, okay, so sorry, in this case, D is a shared folder. So yes, as long as, and we'll talk about this here in a second as a common issue that arises, as long as the run as user has access to that folder in the shared drive, then yes, it would work that way. Sorry, I'm reading through this question using macros and master. It's the macro and master and rest. So Vijay's question is kind of around this, what we're seeing here. So are you saying you're not checking this? Let's see, hold on. When I try to open this again, all macros paths are set to staging and hence unable to edit. Say back to the gallery using macro not found. Macro workflow 1 and workflow 2 are using these macros in master workflow. I am using Vijay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, because this is a very specific problem, I'm going to come back to this at the end so that we make sure that we get everything covered in the meantime. But but yes, theoretically that should work. Okay, let's go back to our, so these are our publishing or common publishing issues. Best practices, again, we want to make sure we're saving, not using the save as function. We are checking our tools to bring with us in a workflow. We're wanting to make sure that we keep a single version or single object with version lineage. Yes. Common workflow issues. So one of the things, I see this all the time, is in that users forget to clean up their warnings, their conversion errors, and sometimes just errors. Less so on the errors part, but a lot on the conversion errors and the warnings. The problem with leaving conversion errors and warnings in your workflow is that you become desensitized to when you see them, right? So the idea of these messages is that there could be a problem. It is something in our workflow is not working the way that the workflow probably should. So these warnings and conversion errors pop up in order to help us see issues when they arise. Again, problem is that, like, if there's a union, you know, that common error with the union that says, hey, not all fields exist in both outputs, people won't uncheck that. Or if you're trying to convert some data into another data just using the select tool, but maybe maybe you're doing it with date and date isn't formatted correctly, or there's extra seconds and it doesn't know what to do with it. So it drops them and it gives you a conversion error. The problem with that is, again, it's just going to stack up, and it's going to also slow your machine down a little bit. So if you have hundreds of workflows and they all have a bunch of little conversion errors or warnings in it, it's going to slow your server down. So we want to make sure that we are fixing those conversion errors and warnings. To note, select tools, I put select tool, I always talk about select tools. Select tools slow your workflows down. So if you have tools that do select functions, if anyone's taking the advanced certification, there are a lot of questions around like, hey, which tools have the same functions as the select tool? So you're going to talk about your join, your append, those are the only two I can think of off the top of my head. But when you're using those tools, there's some geospatial tools that work like a select tool. You always want to make sure that you are replacing select functions with like the join. That's probably the most common area. Use your join tool to remove fields you don't need, rename fields that you don't need, change data types on fields so that you're not bringing a bunch of select tools. Sometimes I'll see select tools, like 3 select tools in a row, and it hurts my heart. And then we just have to talk about it with folks about why you don't want to do that. So I think why it has to do that is specifically, like, if you think about how things work on the back end when the XML is running, if you have a select tool, it kind of stops your whole flow there. So it has to wait for like the rest of the workflow to catch up at the select tool. So if you can avoid using them, do avoid using them. Let's take a look at this real quickly, how we can. So if you're getting, let's say, common, conversion errors here, this is a factorial calculator macro I created. So you put in a number and then it does the, it provides the factorial. Oh, if I run it. So 6 factorial is 720. If we wanted to do something where we convert this, like let's say I just want, for whatever reason here, let's say this is some order number and this first number means something. If I tried to change this to like int 16, int 16 might work, I'm sorry. So let's say I want to change it to like a byte, because this number isn't going to fit in there. So sometimes you'll change, you'll try to change your data types and it won't work out for you. So I start getting this conversion error. 720 does not fit into type byte. So if we're going to try to do conversions, we want to try to make conversions with formula tools, or like if you're trying to like trim data or whatever, you want to make sure you're doing it there first before just making the change on the select tool, because we want to get rid of these conversion errors. Again, thinking in the future, right? Like if you have workflows that you're expecting like these conversions to work, and then they don't work because data that you aren't expecting to come in, or misshapen data comes in, this helps you really identify that quickly. So you can, oh, hey, I got my report this morning and it was wrong. Why was it wrong? That's how you can, with things like conversion errors and warnings, you can quickly oh, it tells you what tool, select 6. So there was an error here. If you're not cleaning that up, it just becomes noise, right? So make sure that you are always cleaning and fixing these things up here. Data connections are another big pain point we see when working through the publication process. Generally, there are two issues with that. So it's so we talk about data connections as in generally we think of data connections, we think of our connection to our relational database of some sort. Snowflake, SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, whatever database you're using, you can use Alteryx to manage those connections. We'll talk about that in a second. But we also need to start thinking about access to shared folders, right? So BJ asked earlier, hey, if I create my macro repository in some shared folder, should the macros, reach out and check on that? Can it reach out to that shared drive to grab those dependencies? Another similar, another similar thing we see is sometimes if you have a file, a common example is oh, I have CSVs that drop into some shared folder every day, and I need to make sure that I'm picking them up, right? As long as everything's set up correctly, Alteryx should have no problem with it. So common issues that we see. One, the machine, the Alteryx server isn't mapped the same way that local machines are, right? So just because I call it a Z drive doesn't mean that the Alteryx server will always call it a Z drive. Or just because I have access to the Z drive or a certain space in the Z drive doesn't mean that the Alteryx server will have access to that space in the Z drive. So we just need to make sure that we are doing all of that correctly. Doing all that correctly. You can either, one, make sure that everything's mapped correctly on the server, or if you are building workflows and the full extension of that. So rather than putting Z, if I put ignite / data meaning / and then whatever folders would normally get me to that, Alteryx, the server should be able to translate that. So it doesn't matter what letter drive I've given that, as long as it knows, the full extension to that folder, things should work out. The second part to that is when we talk about run as users. So on the Alteryx, and again, this is something I wish I could show you, but with it, when you are setting up your Alteryx server, actually, let's do some quick Googling. When you are, where is it? Alteryx server run. So there is, oh, this is a question. Get this. Within the documentation, Alteryx, sorry. Where is it? Yes, okay. So when you're using the gallery, when you're setting up the, let's see, workflow credentials. As you're setting up your server, there's one setting here, and I believe it's on the, it's in the persistence layer. No, it's not the persistence. I think it's in the gallery section where it's hey, we select a run as user. So generally what we suggest here is putting in some service account that has general access to most things. And then when you're running your workflows, it's going to make sure that. So if you don't set a run as user, if you don't set a run as user, Alteryx will run as the machine, the machine that it's installed on. It will run as the admin for that machine, which generally doesn't have access to anything outside of the machine. So we want to make sure that we're utilizing a run as user whenever possible. We also have the ability to create credentials, and I'll show you this real quick within the server. So if you want to create some, so run as users are the base authority. So if you assign a credential to a workflow, it's going to use these credentials instead. I have a hierarchy somewhere, and I don't know where it is specifically, but essentially, if you don't want to create like a run as user, if your organization is against using service accounts for that manner, you could create credentials in here that also have access. So what I'm going back to is that we always want to make sure that the user that's running the workflow has access to those shared drives, and that's the error that we see most often. We also talked about data connections. So that was connections to like some local repository. We also talk about connections to traditional RDBs. If we have some SQL Server, Alteryx Gallery has the ability to create a connection that I can share with people, which essentially just has an embedded connection string that if you're using Windows AD, it'll use local credentials. So or you can set it up so that like I use my credentials, but if there's like some service account, let's say a SQL service account or a Snowflake service account that exists only on that instance, you can embed those credentials so that I can share it, and then users can connect no problems. We want to make sure we're using these because often when users create their own connections and they embed their credentials and then they publish, and then like a few months later they have to reset their password and then all their workflows fail. But also sometimes like users don't generally know what connection they're creating, right? So they might connect something that's attached to a DSN, and when they try to publish it, the DSN won't exist on the machine. So just creating some sort of standard way to do connections is a great practice to help avoid all of these publication errors. And through data connections is probably the best way to do that. The DCM, which is a fairly new product, I think it came out in 21.4. A data connection manager allows essentially that same process to happen, but for users. So my data connection, my DCM, my connections and my credentials that I create are only accessible by me. Other people can utilize them when running from the gallery, but I can't share a credential or I can't share a connection to another user. Like if I share a workflow, it's going to fail. It works really well for the publishing aspect. It's a little bit wild west, unfortunately, though, because like I can create these connections, but then the admin doesn't have access to those, or you have to actually do some Mongo checking to get like where are all these DCMs, like what are all these connections that people have created. So it can be kind of unruly. But it does make for an easier publication process, and it also makes for an easy way to update credentials. So let's say I do embed my credentials in here. Every credential workflow that my credential is associated with, I just have to update it once here in the credential section. So everything should start working going forward. And that's might be a little confusing. We're not talking about the DCM today. We've talked about it before in the past, and we will talk about it more in the future. If you have questions about that, let us know. Let's see here. Yeah, again, so if you're unfamiliar with DSNs versus DSN-less, you might want to read up a little bit on DSN-less connections. So rather than creating a local connection, which is a DSN that has all the information embedded into it, you can create a connection string that's really easy to share with users. Queuing jobs. This is the other thing that we see a lot of on the Alteryx Gallery. Sometimes we'll see jobs queuing up and running. So this is a good example here. So these two workflows are taking a long time to run, and all these queue up afterwards. So we just want to be aware. Well, so there's a few things that could lead to this, right? One, if you're giving users free reign to publish their workflow or to schedule their workflows, it's pretty easy to get this because people just kind of schedule things when they need it done, right? So let's say we see this a lot actually, where 4 in the morning, everyone's jobs are running. So you'll have jobs queued up until 8 a.m. and then things are fine after that. But we want to use in the new version of the server, let's see, on the admin side, you can start to see like when your jobs are forecasted. I'm sorry, schedule forecast. You can see when your jobs, like when you've got a lot of spaces. So like I note here that I've got, during, if I look here, I'm like, oh, okay, 4 a.m. seems to be a pretty open spot for me, so I can make sure that I schedule this. Now, not everybody has access to this, only the admins do. So if you want to if your organization wants to manage all scheduled jobs, or they want to create some way to give people, an understanding of when jobs exist, those are both options for you. You can also, and we talked a little bit about the Mongo last week, okay, we'll talk about this here. Within the Alteryx, so there's 3 different parts of the, let's see, MongoDB. Within the Alteryx Mongo, there are 3 different schemas. Within the Alteryx Mongo, there are 3 different schemas. There's the Gallery schema, the Gallery Lucene schema, and the Alteryx Service schema, which is what we're going to be looking at here. But within our Alteryx Server schema, within the Alteryx Server schema, you can look up things like queue jobs, results of workflows, what jobs are scheduled for the future. So you can connect to this MongoDB. Alteryx has a built-in Mongo input tool. So as long as you follow instructions for querying that, which we did in last week's webinar, it's pretty easy to go in there and pull the information out in order for you. Like if you want to create some, we see people build like Tableau reports or Power BI reports, or even Alteryx reports where they're saying, hey, here's when free spots in like the scheduling queue open up. Unfortunately, there's no way to like lock down like areas where people are trying to scheduling. So you just got to stay on top of that with a tool. Going to your Mongo is a super easy way to do that. It seems kind of daunting, the whole Mongo thing, because it's not like a traditional relational database or like a like tabular structure. It's all JSON data, so I think that sometimes makes people nervous. But with Alteryx, it's super easy to get in there and kind of get the information out. So you just need to make sure that you understand this, which quick Google should probably also help you get to that. And then once you're pulling the data down, you're all smart, you'll figure it out. So that's the Mongo, and that's kind of it. Unfortunately, when it comes to the different points that I needed to make here today, I did want to show you that Mongo, but I can't. But we are going to talk about the APIs real quick, because what happens sometimes is people will try to, another area that we see is people will try to set up their APIs and they don't understand it, or they're using the wrong information to make this setup happen. So we're just going to talk about this real quick so that you can understand what is available to you via the API and how to set that connection up. So if you go to your gallery here and you click on the question mark and you go to API documentation, now I want to show you this because this is a common error that people might see. If I click on API documentation, I'm going to get this error. It's not going to know where to go. We haven't set this up, unfortunately, correctly on our server. It's currently pointing to localhost, which makes sense on the machine, but I haven't repointed it to my server address. So I had to manually come in here and add my server address. So you add your server address here. It's server address / web API / swagger / UI / index, and it's going to bring you to this user interface part. To note, it's also going to mess up here with your. There's 3 different versions of the API. So there's version 1, which was available until I think 2020.2. It's being sunset, so you're going to have to be aware of that. And then you've got version 2, which I think was only around for 2 versions as well, and then version 3, which is the current version. So version 3 is very robust. It's got a ton of endpoints that version 1 and version 2 didn't have. And also use OAuth 2.0, which you can utilize with version 1. So if anyone's familiar with that, this is more of like a handshake method for authorization rather than I send you some things and you send me some information back. So what this will do is I send you a username and a password, then you send me a token, and then I use that token for all subsequent requests, where rather than sending embedded credentials in for every call. It's just an added layer of security, and a lot of people prefer this to the OAuth 1.0. In order to set this up, so like let's say I'm here and I go to collections, I see all of these different options for me. So what's nice about the version 3 of the API is that I can get a lot more information about my Alteryx server, which again, if you're getting good at the Mongo, you can find a lot of this information out through the Mongo. But if you want to do this job, let's say you have a bunch of different, let's say you have a handful of Alteryx galleries and you want to do some like centralized thing that's going to connect to all your different galleries, you can use this API to make those connections. But you can also do cool things like in the new version of this, you can take like let's say you have a sandbox machine and then you have a production server and you want to do some process where you automate pushing things from sandbox to production. You can utilize the server APIs to do that. Within the sandbox machine, there's like a flag that says migrate to production, which is, and then you'd have some workflow that checks every workflow that's flagged for that, and then you can download the workflow, and then there's another there's an endpoint. So we have a workflow here that's like, hey, I want to get, so I'm just gonna retrieve a workflow, and then there's a post, which is a subsequent call that would allow you to like upload new workflow or upload a new version of an existing workflow to your gallery. So this is these are all available to us and they're very cool. But so we're in here, we're testing, right? So the original post was more of like, how do I get in here and how do I play around with this? If I come here and I click on this this red exclamation point, we just want to make sure that we're going to request the type is going to be request body. You're going to want to find your client ID and your secret, which 2 things. One, your user, you want to make sure that your user has access. So if we click on Tracing, and we need to make sure that my permissions allow me for API access. Once that has been done, I can go to my profile and I can come down here and I can grab my keys here. So it asks, if you are looking here, it asks for the client ID and the secret. Those line up to the API access key and the API secret. So I just copy this and I come over here. And then I have my secret, which I have on another sheet, so none of you can steal it. Not that I think any of you would, but it's a crazy world we live in. So I copy and I paste this onto here, and I say authorize. This may fail. This fails because I have this localhost issue. But normally this would come up as blue here, and then I can start running all of my test APIs from this section. And that's, your API bit. There is if you, I'll show you this, Alteryx API v3 and H. Make sure that you do this search with Dan H, because he is the man and he wrote this great article here that talks about version 3 and how you connect to it. And then he also built this macro pack, which you can use to kind of build these workflows out really quickly. So this was, you know what, here, I'm just going to drop this in the chat so everyone has an answer to it. I'll drop this in the chat. And then I'm going to go to questions real quick here. So VJ has a few more questions here. Alex asks, can we provide the recording links to previous webinars? They should all exist either on our YouTube channel or our LinkedIn. So if you go to our LinkedIn page and you go find the, like I think last week's recording, which is where we talk a lot about Mongo, there should be a link available for that in there. Is there Postman collection for the APIs? I don't know the answer to that. There may be somewhere on Alteryx's gallery, so you can check that out. But all of the directions for building the Postman should exist there if you desire. VJ is asking for some video material on the API. Which let me check our schedule here. We may have done that. I think we did that one a few weeks ago. Give me just a second. And then that can help you find what we're looking for, hopefully. Let's see, today. Sorry. Today's 7. I'm unable to do anything on my. Anyways, yes, sorry. We have video material out there somewhere. I suggest checking out our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of that up there. Can we use Postman to call Alteryx APIs? Yes, you can, Alex. You can use Postman to call Alteryx APIs. Again, this is supposed to be what I showed you is supposed to be like a dev playground. So once you have this correctly set up and once you are logged in, you can make demo calls here, and then it'll have all of like here, I'll try it out here. It will have all of your, like, here's your curl, here's your request URL. So if you want to copy and paste this over into Postman or even within Alteryx, like I said, so these macros here really kind of help out for that. If this first one here, the get macro, or the authenticate macro, this helps through the authentication process. Again, you can download these. They're all here at the bottom. Server v3. Actually, I'll show you real quickly. If you need help kind of figuring this out, you can pull these once you download and install them, you can right click and you can say open macro, and you can kind of look how they built it. So this one, the authentication method is you take your base URL, your client ID, and your secret, and then you put your client's ID and secret together with a semicolon in between. Then you have to do some base 64 encoding, and then the authorization header is basic space and that base 64 value, and then that's what you send for your authorization, and then you get back a return that will have the token in it. Then you parse that out, and then you send that token for all subsequent requests. Okay, let's see. So Alex, hold on a second. I'm just going to dismiss some of these questions. I apologize. I don't know how to work this. Let's see, Postman collection. Alex, I hope that answered all your questions, or at least got you pointed in the right direction. Okay, Ricardo asks, I have an API access key and secret. When I test with the v3 collections and ensure credits for request body, a 401 authorized, how do I resolve? All right, so Ricardo, let's take a look at that real quickly here. Did you have let me ask you this first. Did you have the issue here with the localhost bit? That might be one of them. So you clicked here and you clicked on request body, is that correct? And you put in client ID and secret, you clicked authorize, it said it gave you a 401. Let me ask, is this blue? Is this exclamation part here blue? No, yes, it is blue. Okay, so you should be able to just click on the try it out and it should give you a response. This specific one may require you to put in a parameter. Let's go try workflows and then just click get workflow records. This one should work. You should be able to just try that out. This should be fine. Test it out, get back to me. Let's see. Francis asked, how can I maintain a data type for workflow? At the end of a workflow, data is saved in access, but the data type of the data changes. I've also noticed that the chain batch macros data type changes. So, Francis, that's a big question. Okay, so generally, right, your workflow shouldn't change unless somewhere it's being changed. So it's possible somewhere in a select tool or a join, the data type is changing because it's set up that way, and then we just haven't been able to find it. Batch macros are different because what happens generally, or sorry, macros are different because there might be a select tool within the macro that's changing the data type. Let's say it needs a specific data type to actually run correctly. So like they'll change at the beginning of the macro and then they won't change it back. So that's just something you need to be aware of in your workflow. I will show you this actually. This is kind of cool. And this isn't used a lot. Actually, I think this is in the advanced exam as well, and maybe it's the core exam. But if I have some workflow where I have like a select tool, so let's say I have a dummy set of data right here. I can say, let's just say test, and then let's say test 2, and then I have a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I have a value of A, B, C, D. Okay, so I have this very complex data set here, and I have some select tool that I have made changes on my data type. So like say it's N16, but I want to make sure it's N64 because later if it changes, I don't want to lose anything. And I changed this to VW string because this could be as much as 5 and I don't want it to, for whatever reason. Okay, what I can do here is I can save this. So I can go to options, save field configurations. And it saves it as a YXFT file type. So let's just do this to my desktop. And select demo, call it select demo. And then what you can do is in the future, like if I have another select tool, I can go to options and I can load field names and types with this YXFT. So I say, okay. And it made all of the proper adjustments here. So is if down the line, you see something like this and you want to make sure you just get everything back to normal, you can use this tool. But also to note, you can say, like let's say I manually make a change here, but I want to change everything back. I can say revert all to original type and size, or revert highlighted to original type and size. You have options. I would check out this options panel on the select. There's a lot of really neat things here that people don't understand you can do with the select tool, like adding prefixes and suffixes, removing prefixes and suffixes, clearing renames, selecting all, deselecting all, sorting. Again, you can revert back to this field order. So let's say you have 100 fields and you want to find a field, you sort on ascending, and then you deselect something or you rename something, then you can click revert to incoming field order. There's a lot of ways to kind of roll through your select tool here. And then you can do like mass moves and stuff like that. So that's the select tool. Ricardo, I assume that the fact that you haven't responded means you're good to go. So, Francis, we're going to dismiss yours. Thank you so much for asking questions. Thanks for being here. Can you provide recording links to previous one? If you can't find, awesome, glad, Ricardo. If you can't find any of the recordings, also feel free to reach out to us. To note, Data Meeting, we do a lot of these trainings. So if you want individually tailored trainings around APIs or anything that has to do with the Alteryx server, we'd love to come in and help you guys out. And we can do that like with your entire organization or one-on-one, however you want to, tailor that. We're very flexible and we like helping people out with that. So VJ asked, any tips to avoid union error or field conversion errors? Yes, field conversion errors. Well, let's talk about union first because that's super easy. So let's say I want to union these two together and I call this one, let's say I renamed it test 3 here just for we could run the workflow and then I see this warning. Uh-oh, we know this warning happens. How do we, but let's say we're okay with this. I'm like, yep, I got it. Thank you for notifying me. I know this is a problem. We can really easy under the canvas section here. If you click on the union, I'm sorry, not the canvas section, the configuration, you can say ignore and continue process records, and that warning goes away. Most often you see this like after a join, like so if you're creating like a left join or an outer join or whatever, you know that you're going to see this because you have fields coming in on one side or through the join that don't exist on one side. So you see that often and you can just say ignore. You can also, just to note here, since we're talking about the union, you can create this as like a way to stop a function. Like let's say you are expecting everything to line up, but for whatever reason, something doesn't line up and you know it's going to cause problems for you down the road, or it's going to create a report that's bad and you don't want it to be that way. You can just create something in the same way that we talked about removing these things so that they don't become noise. You can also add them so that it very like is like, hey, I need to see why this happened. There are options for you and tools like this. So, hey, we want to create an error here. We don't want to ignore that, or we don't even want a warning because that doesn't matter. We want to make sure that our workflow shuts down completely. We can do that with the union tool. The other question was field conversion errors. Usually what I do for converting fields, and this thing is kind of cumbersome, but it tends to work. If I do my best to always do some sort of like cleaning here, like especially for dates. I always do like date time stuff. Essentially, like, the age-old question is I have a field and it potentially has 20 different formats for my date. How do I do something that cleans it all so it's a quick and easy conversion? Unfortunately, you can build a macro that does that, and then you only have to build it once, but you would have to use something like the formula tool to like kind of check for a bunch of different types. You could, what do you think about that? Yeah, I think you could create a macro that's like, check against like a batch macro. So let's say that these are the 20 formats that exist in there, and then it just runs a conversion for each of those 20 formats, and then it makes sure that like, yeah. Anyway, so you build to it, but back to the original question. Use the formula before select tool. I also, and maybe a lot of people don't love this, but I like to add columns. What's nice about adding a column is I can actually change the data type, and then I'll drop the original column later. Because if I update a column, I can't change the type, unfortunately, here. So if I want to, create a new structure and a new type, I'll always add a column and drop the original column later. VJ, let's talk about that a little more. Are you getting like, okay, so to note, CSVs don't store metadata about data types. So when you write to a CSV, everything's going to come back in as a string. So if it's important that you maintain the metadata of the fields, Excel, or using Alteryx's native YXDB file format. Alteryx works really quickly with that, but if you're just like having to save data to do it somewhere else, or like if Alteryx is always going to be the end point for this, try using the YXDB files. So if you're writing and then you're trying to read it again and it's like, hey, this isn't a date field, it's a text field, that's going to be your problem there. Oh, Yuli. Oh, thank you for the nice compliment. He said this is one of the most practically useful Alteryx webinars I attended thus far. I'm glad you like it. We do these every week. So we also do, again, I'm going to talk us up here. We do our data in the wild, and we do live stuff all the time. So follow us on LinkedIn and on YouTube, and all that content will be out there. So if you want to go back through that, or again, you have our contact information. So if you want to reach out and you want very specific tailored training, or we do a lot of like open office hours too. So if you want to better understand your Alteryx environment or what you can do, we'd love to chat with you. Okay, VJ, cool. Thank you also for asking questions, because the worst is when I get in here and no one's asking questions, and then I'm just all alone. Let's see. VJ, let's go back to your question about the macro. Okay, so the original question was for macro. Oh, also it's 2 minutes till end time. So we're gonna use the rest of this time to answer this question. Thank you to everybody for coming. We really appreciate you being here. Let us know, again, if you have any questions. Follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, all that stuff. Again, my name is Trace Marks. If you want to follow me, I try to put up content on LinkedIn as well. So I think I'm working on one now that is Alteryx plus SQL Server, and I'm very excited for that content. So I hope to see you all in the future. Yeah, sorry, there's a question around the macro piece. Yes, you should be able to have those macros in a shared drive, and then accessing that shared drive, as long as you don't. So when you publish a workflow, let's see, when you publish file, let's say I say this to my gallery. This is actually, if I say file, save as private gallery, let's do it for. And I want to manage my workflow assets. If you leave this unselected here, it will still point to C. So like, let's say this was in our D drive, you should leave this unselected, and it'll be like, okay, I need to make sure that I'm always going to the D drive to get this. But again, whatever user is running it has to have access to that location. So that should hopefully help clarify that up a little bit. Thank you all for coming. We're at time. Have a great day. Be safe, and we'll see you next week.